All right, it's time for another Herle Burly two-part pod. Thank you for allowing me into your AirPods for another week, Herle Burlyites, and thank you to Toontown Dano for giving us this recent review on Apple Podcasts. Love this podcast, love how they love each other and go after each other. The guests give you a window into their humanity you might not find on Twitter or other blogs. Top of my list for weekly casts, I always come away learning something new and having a good laugh. Well, Toontown Dano, if I may call you by your given alias, you have captured the aims of our podcast perfectly. I will raise my next rum and coke in your honor. For part one today, it's the return of Peter Weltman. Peter is Ontario's independent financial accountability officer. And the first time he guested with us, well, it was one of the newsiest and most listened to episodes in the history of the Herle Burly. We're going to talk about budget making and last week's Ontario budget, the choices that were made and the path the province has charted from here. Part two of the pod is our political panel with Jenni, Byrne, and Scott Reid. As Toontown Dano so accurately described, they love each other, they go after each other. Then I imagine they return to their non-Herle Burly lives and shit-talk me for the rest of the week. We'll pick up on the Weltman conversation, then we'll do a deep dive into what smells like an impending spring-summer election. Take a whiff out there. I smell mud, worms, and the flop sweat of 338 sitting MPs. The government isn't going to be defeated on the budget, so they're going to have to pull the plug on themselves. Who makes that decision? How do you do it and not get any blowback from your own caucus, from Canadians? What's the calculus here? Plus, we'll pull a question out of the Herle Burly mailbag if there's time. We'll each do our Hey Yous. Stick around for that. Peter Weltman, welcome back to the Herle Burly, and thank you for not realizing what an amateur hour we were the last time you were here, and for coming back.
Well, you see, I've been listening to the show for so long, I would be incriminated if I felt it was amateur hour too. So, there's a self-preservation going on there. I'm thrilled to be back. It's great to be back. And I really want to comment on the comment you got from two-time Dano, I think his name was, about the idea of being able to learn something and having fun. My daughter and I were having a long discussion about podcasts, and that's exactly what she said. She said, you need to be able to have fun and learn something, otherwise it's not going to work. So kudos to you. You've met her stringent guidelines, and we're all good.
Excellent. Wow. Yeah. Young people listening to people talk about politics. Hey, what's with that hair? That's more hair than you had the last time you were on.
Well, I had a haircut the last time I was on, but you should have seen me before that. I was like out of the 80s. And my wife looked at me and she went and looked back at pictures from when we started dating, and she kind of went, oh, if I'd have known that. Yeah. So no product, no grease, no nothing today. I've been doing that for the last 2 weeks. So until I get my haircut, this is the way I come.
There you go. So we're more than a year into this thing. How are you holding up?
Frustrated, but I mean, I'm doing okay, right? Like I said before, I don't have to show up at a warehouse to go to work, or, go to a store and deal with folks that, want to contravene public health guidelines. I don't have to, I have lots of space between my neighbors and and the closest I get to them is when I'm walking the dog or we go to the dog park. So we're all outdoors and we're all in the same boat. And so I'm very lucky that I really, I'm doing okay. And from a work point of view, we've been more productive than we've ever been. So maybe that's by having me shut up here in Ottawa and my staff, and getting out of their way to get some work done. So we've got 24 reports out this fiscal year. We got 20 folks on staff. So I guess we're hanging in. We're hanging in okay.
So do you think you're more productive? Do you think that the team is more productive in this working environment than they are in an office? And how's that going to affect you when the pandemic's over?
Oh, they might just keep me locked up in Ottawa. I don't know. We've always had a work from home policy. That was our competitive advantage with the Ontario Public Service. So we would, because the office is right downtown Toronto. But we've always had folks able to work from home. Anywhere between, roughly half the office on any given day was working from home. So it was a natural thing. And this move to fully working from home is not a huge deal, but it will affect, camaraderie. There are some new folks we've had on stream that we've never really met in person. So, we'll bring people back kind of sporadically, just to try to maintain that sort of office charm, as it were, if you can get charm out of an office. But we're still working all the details out. However, my competitive advantage looks like it's gotten, blown away now that the Ontario Public Service looks like it's going to remain at home, on a part-time basis anyway for the good long time. So,
is that right?
That's what I hear. That's what I hear. They're not rushing everybody back to the office, and we're thinking through, some departments or ministries more than others, thinking through how to work from home longer, provide more flexibility, because it works, right? It works. I've known that for years. We've been doing that. I've been doing that in my workplaces for the last 10 years, giving people the flexibility. And my kind of philosophy is, hey, we're hiring for output, not input. So I don't care if you're on Mars, as long as you got a laptop and a connection, and you're doing the work you need to do, and you're doing it to the quality we need, we're good.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how much of that changes. Now, I imagine that most people are kind of anxious not to work out of their homes 5 days a week either. I did this interesting study a number of years ago about people's attitudes toward their commute. And I expected that everybody, especially in the GTA, was going to hate their commute. But it turns out lots of people like their commute because it's their alone time. It's their time away from the house and away from the office. It's their own time, especially if they're in a vehicle. They like that time often.
Yeah, and I miss that. I find it hard because I'm in a little bedroom in the middle of our small house, and I hear everything. So I actually have a hard time when I have to do work that I need to focus on. It's a little tricky, but my commute, was a 4.5 hour commute, right? I used to take the train to Toronto, and then hang out there for a few days, and then take the train back. So I do miss that. Every week was a little hard, but I do miss that alone time as well.
So, hey, there was an Ontario budget this week, and I want to get to that. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about budget making more broadly in this environment and in this circumstance, because there's also the context of the upcoming federal budget, which will be, unlike the provinces, the first one in 2 years. And so I want to just talk a little bit about why is this a particularly difficult circumstance for governments to make a budget in?
I think I'll try not to dive into numbers too quickly, but that's really what it's about. So I think when you're making a budget, the key anchor is your revenue forecast. Is that certainly, that's a main key anchor. There are other anchors. To derive your revenue forecast, you have to have a GDP or an economic forecast. So what is your economic growth going to look like? And that largely determines your personal income tax revenue. Number of folks employed determines income tax revenue. It determines also some of your social expenditures, depending if employment goes up or down. So forecasting the economy, which is always a tricky business to begin with, has been incredibly difficult in this last year and a half or so. And I'll give you a couple examples. So we talk about, budgets. The Ontario government came out with an update last March of 2020. And if you read the update carefully, it looks like a budget that was put together in, February. And then it was like, oh shit, oops, I wasn't supposed to swear this time. I was told not to. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. We have a pandemic. And then you see a few lines of spending that were kind of thrown in almost in a different font. It was a little bit weird. But the revenue forecast was basically the same as it had been. It had been trending along a normal line. GDP growth was forecasted 2 or 2.1%, which is what the year before. So effectively no change. And a budget deficit of 20 billion, largely because they threw in an extra few billion of spending. That budget was basically, effectively dead on arrival, right? So a valiant attempt, a brave attempt to try to put some kind of thing in front of Ontario citizens to say, here's where we think things are going, but effectively completely out to lunch and not through any fault of their own. Let's fast forward. So anyway, let's not fast forward just yet. So if you're trying to figure out, so we started at 20 billion. We ended up the year, we're going to end up around 37 or 38 billion dollars deficits. That's almost double what was forecast a year ago. How useful is that, right? I mean, anytime you're doing any kind of forecast, if you are out by that much, you can't make a decision on that. if you're within 10 or 20%, you have a chance of making a decision. You have a better idea of sort of compartmentalizing your risk a little bit. You could be high or you could be low, but out by like 100% is craziness. You can't do anything with that. So I think that's the key issue folks are having trouble with. We'll talk about this budget recently in just a minute, because there's some really interesting assumptions there. But I think from a federal level too versus provincial. So federal government, effectively, most of the money is just shipped out, right? It gets collected and then shipped out to provinces via transfers, health transfer, social transfer. Most of it gets shipped out to CPP, to old age security, employment insurance, guaranteed income supplements. So most of that is transfers to individuals, transfers to other levels of government, transfers to other institutions. A little bit of it's spent internally on salaries and on things like defense and, tax collection and processing, social programs, et cetera. But those programs are open-ended, right? EI, all those other ones. So because they're in legislation, the government has to pay. So if demand doubles, triples, quadruples, the government has to pay. And with a pandemic, it's extremely difficult, especially when you've never dealt with this before, to forecast what the demand is going to be on the social programs and on the economy writ large. And then you introduce these new, the CERB and the Qs and the other support programs that have never really been introduced before. Your focus is really on trying to keep people whole as best you can as you figure out, where the world's going. So I think, I maybe as a budget officer, I shouldn't say this, but I think putting out some kind of fiscal plan in the middle of chaos can be very misleading. You can't give folks a chance to say, yeah, we're going to use this as a planning document. It's not a planning document. It's effectively a wild ass guess. So my opinion, not necessarily the official budget office opinion, but my opinion.
And that's because the forecasts for economic growth are so uncertain. And are they still that uncertain at this point? Or is there some consensus that's developing?
There is a consensus that's developing, I think, and I think it's on the upside. So I think we're a year into the pandemic. We have better data. We have a much better feel for how this thing behaves. We have a much better idea as to how people behave. I think we have a pretty good idea where the outbreaks are happening and why and how. Whether or not that's being transmitted to folks is a different discussion. And we have comparables. We have other countries that have come out of the pandemic, and we're able to have a look and see how their economies are performing. So there's a lot better data available today and a lot less uncertainty. So that uncertainty band that I talked about back in March 2020 being 100%, maybe now it's getting closer to that 20% uncertainty band. I'm just making up these numbers. I don't have reams of calculations to back them up, but just to give you and the listeners a sense. And so let's flip over to this budget, just as an example. So when this budget was put together, consensus forecasts, which is how Ontario does its budget, it looks at private sector forecasts, takes the average, and then drops the forecast by, let's say, half a point or something, and it's the real GDP forecast. Back in February, the real GDP forecast for this fiscal year, this calendar year, 2021-22, was around 4%. If you look today and look at all the bank forecasts, I just did all that last night in preparation for our interview, the forecast, the consensus is closer to 6 and 6.5%. That's a huge swing in a month and a half. Huge. So that has significant potential ramification for revenues, right? That revenue figure that's in this budget could seem to be very prudent going forward. We could see something a lot bigger than what's being shown in this budget.
How often since 1968 has the economy grown by 6.5% or 7% in a year? That's an extraordinary growth.
But it is extraordinary. Yeah. I think you're right. Back in the late 60s it did, but we were coming out of a war. We were the only, North America was really the only economy left standing. Europe and Asia and everybody else were starting to rebuild, especially Europe. So they started to have money to buy stuff, and we were the only place to buy stuff from. So not surprising, we had tremendous economic growth in the 50s to roughly around the early 70s.
So Just one last thing about the federal budget before we turn to Ontario and I do. Given what you've said about the financial situation and the forecasts, what kind of contingency would you expect to see in a federal budget against the uncertainty?
At this point in time, I would probably want to, I would expect to see at least a 10% contingency, but it could be built different ways. It might even be higher. So there's two ways to provision against this stuff. One is your revenue forecasts, right? Or your GDP forecasts, which drive your revenue forecasts. So you have a bunch of different layers that you can play with, or little toggles and little things you can toggle. So if your revenue your GDP forecast is fairly conservative, as we've seen in the provincial budget, you give yourself some room on the upside. So maybe you give yourself, like, who knew you'd get 20% room on the upside? That's insane. I mean, nobody would ever figure that. But you give yourself some room, and then you have your personal income tax forecast, which usually is correlated pretty directly with nominal GDP, so real GDP plus inflation. But you may want to change that relationship, so you give yourself some room there. And then you may want to have some actual overt, transparent contingency, which is money stuck in a contingency fund, saying we're going to draw this down if we have an emergency that we hadn't provided for. So I would say 10% at a minimum. I would build in more, and I would do it maybe along all of these different sort of axes, if you will, or using all these different toggle switches to try to give myself as much flexibility as I could.
Just so people understand, though, every dollar you put into contingency is a dollar you can't spend. If you didn't have that contingency, you would have more spending room. Huh?
That's a really good point, because to get that money out of contingency, there is some political inertia required to move that money. At least federally there is, because you have to go, sometimes you have to go back to Parliament to get approval. In Ontario, it doesn't work that way, which is interesting. I learned this when I got here. Ontario has approval to spend the maximum spending plan that the Parliament approves. But if they want to move money around, they can do that just on a Treasury Board order effectively. And then at the end of the year, these Treasury Board orders are reported out and everybody sees what happened. What we did when I showed up is we started doing these quarterly expenditure monitors. And I think you nailed me on that last time I was on the show. And so we actually show what's been going on in the previous quarter and where the money's been moved in the different Treasury Board orders. So everybody has transparency into what's happening. So we've maybe added a little political inertia to moving that money out of contingency into programs.
Okay. One last federal question. What is your view of the need for stimulus in the economy right now? They've got that $70 to $100 billion fund, and there's now significant debate, it appears to me, about whether or not that money is needed, and if it's needed, whether it's needed now or later.
I think what this pandemic has shown is that certain groups have really been hammered, really, like, way disproportionately been hammered. I think the inequality debate that's been happening for the last 20 years has really been brought to bear after this pandemic. And I think too, there are certain businesses, forget the people for a second. I mean, don't forget them. That's who businesses are, but certain businesses have been disproportionately hammered as well. So in my mind, it's sort of like you've dug this big hole. Will the hole fill itself up by itself and go back to the way it was? I don't think it will. Because I think people have been scarred, and you need some help to get those folks back to a place where they can start contributing to the economy. So there's my philosophical answer to your question, which is yes, I think there is still more stimulus needed. And I think, potentially there's an opportunity, depending on how the government decides, is to use this crisis as an opportunity to maybe rectify some things that weren't working well in the past. That's about as far as I want to get into any kind of policy advice, but I would say there's opportunity to do that should the governments choose to.
I've been described as a guy who likes big, game-changing ideas dressed in simple packages. George Reid on a perfectly executed power sweep. Reverse searing a great steak. The music of the band. So in the world of mobile technology, I'm naturally drawn to 5G. Just one number and one letter, with a massive upside on how we'll live our lives for the next 20 years. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is working to maximize their 5G network for all Canadians. TELUS has already been crowned the fastest network in Canada by OpenSignal, an independent third-party company. But 5G will make the internet 10 to 100 times faster than it is now. Herle Burlyites, this is a world where bigger isn't better, faster is. Just a few of the highlights. TELUS 5G will improve spotty service and network congestion, and they'll use it to dramatically expand and improve rural connectivity. All that increased speed and reliability means far more innovation for small businesses no matter where they operate. Stuff like better access to big data, immersive digital showrooms for retailers, automated inventory tracking and ordering, and drone deliveries. That's just scratching the surface. Think of what 5G will mean in healthcare and education, and how it can enable a whole new world of precision in agriculture, better food outcomes, and environmental sustainability. Nearly $200 billion in growth and prosperity for Canada's economy over the next 20 years. Couldn't come at a more important time as we begin to climb our way out of COVID lockdowns. All that impact, just one number and one letter. We'll talk more specifically about what TELUS 5G can do in the coming weeks. But for now, you can find out more about it at telus.com/5G. Okay, let's talk about the Ontario budget.
Okay.
Because seemingly nobody else is. So why don't we do it?
Well, I mean, thank God, right? Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. So no, I'm happy with it.
What's your assessment of their fiscal projections?
Well, I think
reasonable.
So I'll tell you a few things. I really like the budget and for a whole bunch of reasons that people aren't going to care about. But I'm a geeky budget officer. I like it that it was shorter than normal. It didn't get into a lot of pictures and a lot of flowery language. It was very, much cleaner. A lot of assumptions laid out behind the forecasts, behind the spending forecasts. There were some good examples there of money allocated to, for example, personal support workers. And then there was some sensitivity analysis saying, okay, here's how many hours we're trying to buy with this money. Here's how many, if we add an extra incremental number of hours, here's how much it's going to cost. So actually some examples of buying outcomes. But the thing I really can't stand the most about government finances is that when governments announce they're going to spend money on something, that somehow that's a performance metric, right? I mean, it is, but it doesn't really tell you very much. It just tells you how much they're spending. It does tell you relative to other spending priorities, how much they prioritize item A versus item B. And we talked a bit about that last time, so that's important. But an MPP approves, or the legislature approves the budget, but they've got what are they buying for that? So if you're saying I'm going to alleviate, wait times in long-term care, and I want $1 billion to do it, what am I buying for the $1 billion? Am I buying more services? Am I buying extra, LTC homes? So that's the sort of stuff that I like to see. And there's a tiny bit of that in this budget, but of course that's largely what we do here at the FAO.
If I could just say, what you're saying is equally true of communications. So it drives me crazy when politicians think it is meaningful to stand up and say, we're going to spend $1 billion on long-term care, as if that means anything to anybody. It's a large number, but is it large enough or is it too large? I don't have any bloody idea. What am I getting? What is the outcome that you are looking for? Let me judge that. But, anyway. So,
and how do you know? How do you know $1 billion is the right number, right? Like, how do you know?
Yeah.
Well, there are ways to get there. It's complicated. It's detailed. And it doesn't make for a good soundbite, unfortunately.
So you think it's rigorous?
Well, no, I didn't say that. I think it's transparent. I think it's rigorous in how it lays out its assumptions. And as a budget geek, I'm happy to see that. Now, let's go back to, so I think it's important just folks to understand, we will put out our own independent forecast, probably late May, early June. So we take apart the government's numbers. We're going to look at all of the assumptions driving the revenue side and the expenditure side. And that's how we approach every budget. Sources of funds, uses of funds. And we will then do our own modeling because we have our own economic models. We're not constrained by the private sector forecast model. So we can look at some of them and say, they're out to lunch. We're not going to, they don't know what they're talking about. And to be honest with you, there aren't too many shops that do a good job of forecasting Ontario's economic situation or our fiscal situation because frankly, we're a province, right? And they're not selling a lot of provincial bonds. It's more of a national thing. So some are better than others. Right. And gives us another competitive advantage. We'll look at that and then we'll put out our own forecast. And so the two areas, one is, as I mentioned before, is the assumptions under GDP growth, but also the assumptions under spending. And now we have enough insight into the government spending that we will put out our own kind of version of what the back to balance plan looks like that they've articulated in this budget, which I think is going to be, we're going to have a lot of fun with that. Let me just leave it at that. So there's a lot of assumptions made in there that are pretty wide ranging, and we'll get to that in our piece. And I think what we'll show what the government's line back to balance is, and we'll show what our back to balance line is, and we'll show what what sort of spending restraint frankly needs to happen in order to be able to hit those numbers, and how that spending restraint lines up against what the natural cost drivers are to the big spending programs like health and education.
Well, so they have essentially projected spending in all of the major areas, health, education, children and social services, to be flat for a decade, effectively flat for a decade. And they're still projecting deficits as far as the eye can see. Is the Ontario budget balanceable?
The Ontario budget has been in loosely used structural deficit for a long time, after the last recession. And that is you've hit the nail on the head there. And that seems to be the elephant in the room. This is a big issue. And the reason it's a big issue is because Ontario runs key programs: health, education, social services. The health budget grows at around 3.8% per year. That's a combination of aging demographics. And I think there was a piece that came out last week. I saw a number that came out that by 2040, 24% of the Canadian population will be over the age of 65 or 70, and they will use 71% of the health dollars. That's a reality. So unless we find the fountain of youth and everybody can live to 100 and not get sick, that'll bring costs down. But that's a reality unless you find a way to bend that demand curve. And there are many ways to do that, which I will not get into because that could be very dangerous territory. But that is a reality. The other reality is healthcare inflation isn't CPI. It's got its own inflation. It's got a lot of specialized equipment. These things grow at a faster rate. So, and you have a certain amount of population growth as well. So unless you attack one of those three areas or all of them, you're going to be left with this ongoing increase in the health program until the last of the baby boomers effectively die off. And then it'll start to drop, but that's 40 years out. So,
So you're saying it isn't balanceable?
I'm saying, I never say never. I'm not the government. The government can balance the budget if it wants to. It could be a very, it would have to make some tough choices on the revenue side and on the spending side. So it might not only, we're going to be joined here by the watchdog. So just as an aside,
Excellent.
I think the puppy just showed up to say hello.
Pull him up and let's see him.
Let's see him. I don't know if we can see him. Finn.
Aw,
you see him?
Excellent. Yeah, what's his name?
His name's Finn. He's now I got to put this back. He's a year and a half old now. He's a mini Bernedoodle. So he's very cute, and he's now simmering down. So it's nice. He's not demanding airtime. So it's nice not to have the competition. So.
Well, okay. So let's take the point I made, and you riffed off of it. They have all those expenditures flat for years to come. That's not, frankly, sustainable. right? I mean, yeah, those are effective cuts to those areas. And as I remember Don Drummond saying when he came in and did his analysis of what the government would have to do to balance, he said, you actually have to stop doing things. You can't just put an artificial cap on, say, healthcare or education and pretend that's going to work, because even if it works for a couple of years, those spending demands are just building up and eventually will boil over. So if you want to actually fix your fiscal situation, you have to stop doing some things that you're doing. As I recall his point of view. So they have not chosen that course. They've chosen to pretend that 3% or 4% inflation in healthcare doesn't exist, or that they will cut healthcare by 3 or 4% a year. One of those two things.
Well, I think let's put a little more nuance to that. So for the next 3 years, the government is spending more money. They've allocated more money. They've allocated under the guise of COVID spending, or the guise, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but very much there's some extra funds there. As I said before, they're taking advantage of the crisis situation to be able to allocate more funds to areas that have needed it. Hospital capacity is a big piece on hospital capacity. We did a piece on hospital capacity. In fact, as I was reading the budget, I realized we've written about most of these items over the past year and a half. So it's kind of neat. I'd be able to draw back on the work we've done. So hospital capacity, we did a piece in May. That was a piece that a couple of our staff just were tinkering with models and trying to do some forecasting, and it, much to their chagrin, turned into a report. That was a lot of work to put together. And we showed how even before the pandemic, Ontario hospitals are running at 95% capacity. We're like the third highest in the OECD in terms of hospital capacity. So while people might say, well, that's very efficient, in fact, it doesn't give you any breathing room in case you have a crisis. And of course, that's what happened. And the whole reason for the lockdown initially was to free up hospital capacity so that as people got the virus and got sick, they'd be able to get into the hospital and get treated. And here we are a year later, and now we're going to be running into the same problem. So was this an excuse to fix a longstanding problem? Hey, if I'm the government and I see this as an opportunity, I have some political cover from the pandemic to get in there and fix a problem. Why not? I mean, they've chosen to do that. So the next 3 years, they've chosen to try to do these things. And beyond that, we're actually past another election. I mean, so beyond that, so first of all, how important is it politically to articulate something specific, 6 years out? Two is, how relevant is it? Because a lot can happen between now and then. And that may, again, your confidence interval, your risk, might be too wide to start to get anything too accurate. So they have to, by law, put up a balanced budget scenario. That's what they've done. Is it a realistic one? We'll come out and talk about that when we do our report.
Okay, so let's assume their numbers are correct about the deficit track that we're on. Is it sustainable? And if it is, what isn't?
Okay, great. So let's dial back a couple of years, or a year and a half ago. We do a long-term budget outlook. So we look at the sustainability of Ontario's finances, 30, 40 years into the future. We did the last report on February 2020, and it completely got ignored because the pandemic hit very shortly after. But in there, we said if the government was able to achieve its spending plans, it would get itself down to balance. All right, we're just going to close the door there. Puppy's doing something I don't want to know. And But if they stay status quo, and if they're not able to achieve it, it would require some significant spending restraint or spending cuts. But if they didn't, we would be in a position where debt to GDP would keep growing, interest on debt would keep growing. So sustainability means 30 years out, all policies remaining the same, your debt to GDP or your fiscal situation doesn't change. That's what sustainability is. Maybe it's high and maybe it stays at that 50% level. But if it goes up, then it's not sustainable. If it goes down, well, clearly it is sustainable. Basically, without making those significant changes to spending and the revenue side too, everybody keeps forgetting there's also a possibility to raise more revenue. Without changes there, no, it's not going to stay sustainable. The debt to GDP will keep going up. Interest on debt, harder to predict because you're predicting interest rates, but probably will keep going up at least in line with the debt.
Wow. Okay. So on the revenue side,
yeah,
what are the possibilities on the revenue side? Scott Clark and Pete DeVries wrote a piece about Ottawa's budget in which they suggested that the government should separate long-term structural spending that they're doing from short-term consumption spending like the CERB that they're doing, and that the CERB doesn't have any long-term benefit to future generations, and so therefore should be paid by this generation. And they were suggesting 2 points on the GST. What do you think is out there in terms of possible revenue for Ontario?
Well, I think I love reading what DeVries and Scott write about. It's really they've been there for a long time. GST is a nice, from an economist point of view, is a nice clean tax, right? It's easy to collect, relatively easy to collect, not subject to a bunch of tax loopholes, just a few. It doesn't matter if you squirrel your money away overseas. If you're buying stuff in the jurisdiction, you're going to pay the tax. So there's an economic case to be made for that, and some of that rubs off onto obviously the province. I can't get into, so there's certainly areas to look at. I think the best I can answer with that is that we did a piece about 2 years ago where we talk about revenues as a share of the economy, expenditures as a share of the economy for each province. And we noticed that Ontario's revenue, or per capita rather, sorry, it was per capita, not as a share of the economy. So revenue per capita slightly below the national average, implying that there might be some room there. But that's as far as it goes, right? It doesn't say there's room. It doesn't recommend. It implies. Spending, this is the interesting thing to me. Spending is well below per capita. Program spending, well below. Largely because we have large populations, we have a ton of efficiencies. You can put 5 hospitals in downtown Toronto, and it's a lot cheaper to manage that than it is to have hospitals flung all over, wherever. But so there's so some might say, well, we're spending too much. Well, in fact, per capita, we actually spend amongst the lowest in the country. So these are just indicators, they're baselines, they're reference points. It's not a recommendation, but it gives you a sense as to what may be the art of the possible, what may not be possible.
Francis Donald said to me that the recovery, the Manulife economist, said to me that the recovery is going to be like the roaring 20s for some people and the dirty 30s for other people. Does that mean that we will have room to raise revenue from upper income Ontarians? The people that are enjoying the roaring 20s?
Well, I think, I think we're starting to see that in the UK. I think we've seen corporate taxes go up. Certainly, they're planning to do that. Now, whether those are the folks that are the roaring 20s, that's a whole different discussion. But certainly, they seem to think they have cover to do that, and there may be some political cover to do that here as well. So, I think I would agree with Francis' assessment of the roaring 20s and the dirty 30s, and we've seen it. We see it in the labor market numbers, even in the recovery. So most of the economy has come close to where it was, except for the service economy, right, and the travel economy, and some of those areas. And that's where a lot of the lower income folks start off. And yeah, they've been hammered. It's going to be longer for them to get back. They've had a harder time through it, and a whole bunch of other people really have been able to cope quite well. So there may be political cover to start to look at recovering some of those costs from the folks who've been able to not benefit, but certainly haven't been as badly affected. I mean, a lot of folks have had a chance to not have to spend money on restaurants and on travel, and it's been sitting in the bank account. And other folks have been just dependent on those CERB payments just to be able to buy groceries and make the rent payment. So there's certainly, as I said before, this pandemic has really shone a spotlight on the inequality, and there is scope now, I think, for maybe a little rebalancing. I'm not recommending that it is. Of course, I have to keep saying that. I'm sorry, but that's my job. I'm saying there might be some political scope to be able to do that.
Joe Biden says, "Don't tell me what your values are. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your values are." And what does this budget prioritize?
Well, I think this budget, like I said, the medium term, the finance minister has been clear. We're prioritizing getting you back on your feet and getting shots into your arms. And I think It does that. I mean, it's certainly a lot of money being put into things like shoring up hospital capacity, trying to bring on the personal support workers a little more rapidly. There's a lot of talk about, we're going to grow our way out of this. There hasn't been a lot of detail, supplied, and I'm always a little skeptical when I hear those words. We're going to grow our way out of it, or we're going to find efficiencies. You'll find both. Whether you'll find enough to balance is a whole different question, right? We see something like a bunch of money put into broadband. I think broadband may have been seen by folks as a frill. Now it's a necessity. It's a piece of infrastructure, like a road, like a water pipe. You need it. So I think on balance, this government's budget really does try to focus on those areas where folks have been hit the hardest. I think they're mindful too that Ontario's fiscal capacity is limited. I mean, we are a subnational government. We cannot borrow well above a certain level and still expect to sell bonds to investors. And I think this is speculation. I think I look through this budget and I see there are these holes or these gaps that maybe we'll see filled by additional transfer payments from the federal government. I'm kind of suspecting that's what's going to happen. And I sort of see the room being left in the budget for those significant federal dollars. And let's be honest, during COVID, and we did a piece on this too, and no, I won't stop saying that. I'll keep saying we did a piece on this. We did a lot of work. We showed that at the initial stages, 90% or was it 92% of the money was spent by the federal government in Ontario. So the provincial government did put up some cash, but they don't have the same fiscal resources the federal government does.
One of the things you made news on when you were here last time is telling us that the province was sitting on a large amount of federal transfers for COVID that they had not at that point spent. Does that remain the case, or is the Ontario government spending the federal transfers now?
All that money has been allocated or spent. So if they haven't spent all of it, there's about $4 billion left that they've planned to spend. So that will get spent. That was interesting. It was an interesting reaction to when I was on last time, because again, as I said before, we put out this quarterly monitor and we show people, here's what's been moving around and here's what's not been spent. And the timing was interesting because there was a sense politically in Ontario that not much had been going on during the summer. I don't know that. I don't know that there was or that there wasn't. But if you follow the money and the money is what your guideline is in terms of performance, well, then clearly, there was a perception nothing was happening during the summer. And the government was quite sensitive to that, notably, and some communications tactics that followed. I think you'd appreciate this, is I noticed the last two times we released our expenditure monitor, it was preceded by some kind of major announcement, the last one being the announcement of the budget date. So we did our expenditure monitor Q3. That morning, before we released, Minister got on and talked about his budget date. We do media briefings as well as MPP briefings at every opportunity, every time we release a report. And we had a lot more attendance from ministerial staff than we are normally used to seeing. So clearly we were an issue to be managed, or this was an issue to be managed.
Well, there you go. Don't issue reports. Come on the Herle Burly.
Don't give them any ideas. You know how the game works, right? You know how the game works. If you don't want it, you starve it slowly, right? You don't make it overt. You just sort of, whittle away, and then anyway, I won't get into that, but there are ways to do it. Oh, you have to fund this from within. Oh, you have to fund that from within. Oh, we're putting a freeze on. And eventually people leave, you don't replace them. And then, you've only, you had 20, now you're down to 3, you may as well shut you down. That's how the bureaucratic game works when you're trying to get rid of a program. Not saying necessarily it applies to us. I don't think it does. We're different. But if you're trying to get rid of a program, to the DeVries point, you got to do less. That's how you do less in government. You starve it slowly, and then you shut it down when it's obvious to everybody that there's nothing left here. Sorry, did I give away secrets? Is that did I?
It was great. It was perfectly great. So you talked about holes where there might be federal transfers. If the federal budget had a major cost-shared FedProv program proposal in it, whether that be long-term care or child care or pharmacare, could Ontario participate in such a shared cost program? Does it have the resources to participate?
I think Ontario has a ton of experience in delivering And people will quibble all the time about what's being done wrong. But I think my own experience with healthcare, with education, with, most of the stuff is done pretty darn well. And when you look at other, comparable jurisdictions, we do a pretty darn good job most of the time on things like education, on healthcare. I can't really speak to social services. I'm not really familiar with that area that much. But we do have a very extensive program. It's delivered federally, provincially, and municipally. So I think there's a lot of delivery expertise. There may not be a lot of cash, but there's certainly a lot of delivery expertise. So from that point of view, I think Ontario is quite, between that and between the manufacturing capacity and the brain power that the province has, I think we'd be quite capable of participating in any of those sorts of things from a, like I said, from a program operational kind of point of view. Politically, I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Yeah. But cash, if they had to come up with another $1 billion for LTC or for childcare to match federal spending?
Well, as I always say, I hate that expression. As I've said before and as I've heard before, the government is the government. They make the choices. And if they decide that this is an important priority and it supersedes other priorities, they will go ahead and do it. I mean, we see it already. $2 billion for broadband. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of, what is it? Another $5 billion for hospital capacity. That's a lot of money too in a budget of 160 billion. So yep. Yeah, sure. I think the capacity is there. It's just a matter of the will. Now, if you're asking them to cough up, $90 billion worth of CERB payments, I don't think that's doable, right? It's not going to happen. There's no way. Right. But $1 billion here and $1 billion there is certainly well within the realm of the margin of error of the flex that they have to work with.
Okay. I read the budget and I had trouble understanding where some of the money was going. And I want to talk to you about long-term care. I read all kinds of places about money going into long-term care, but it was hard to understand what the cumulative effect was because it was like, this amount of money, this historic investment builds on the previous program's historic investment in the and I didn't at the end of the day know what it was. What have they done to long-term care? What have they made a significant investment in long-term care?
So they came in and they promised, the previous government promised 30,000 new long-term care beds within a certain time period. I don't remember if it was 5 or 10 years. This government committed to that, but they stretched it out. So it must have been, so they said 15,000 in 5 years and then the other 15,000 maybe later. So from my read, that really hasn't changed. Now we did a report on long-term care last year where we talked about here's how many beds there are in the system, here's what the wait times are, here's what the population growth is. So again, we put a baseline forward as to what does the current program look like. And what we found was, yeah, you're building more beds, but the population of this cohort is growing much more rapidly than the number of beds you're putting in. So in the first 5 years, you're going to stand still in terms of wait times, but really in the next 10 years, you're going to fall way, way short of what you need if you're trying to reduce wait times. We did that. We did a presentation to the Long-Term Care Commission. I think that's the beauty of our work. I'll put another plug in, is that we provide that reference point, right? So what does it look like today? What will it look like 5 or 10 years out based on current situation? And then you can look at the additions and subtractions from that baseline. So I'm seeing and we'll go into this in our budget outlook. And the other place we'll go into it is we will be providing reports to support the Standing Committee on Estimates, which does a pretty darn good job of examining the budgets, the government's spending plans. Now it's constrained; it can't do all the ministries all the time, but it's really the first time I've seen, every senior manager from a ministry having to show up to the legislature and defend the spending, and they spend weeks preparing for this sort of thing. That's not necessarily replicated at the federal level. I mean, the federal level picks and chooses, but it doesn't haul in the entire department and grill them for 15 hours on their numbers. So they do that in Ontario, and it's quite an interesting accountability exercise. We support the committee in that, and we will be providing analysis that'll answer exactly the question you asked. What does this extra $993 million mean? What will it do to wait times, or what will it do to achieve the objectives the government has set out, and will it achieve them? So far, my quick theory is I'm not seeing any new beds. I'm seeing them build them faster and are finding a way to build it faster. Don't know what the impact will be. The $993 million, is that for renovation? Is that to take the 4-bed wards and put them into 2 beds? I'm not 100% sure yet, but we will definitely get at those questions. We'll provide those answers to MPPs, and they can use those as they ask questions of the government's plan. That's what democracy looks like. That's what a representative democracy looks like. That's what parliamentary accountability is. And I'm proud that we're part of that.
Yeah, it's a great, it is a great service, Peter, for sure. And you touched on, because there's 2 issues. Before the pandemic, all the talk about long-term care was on more beds. How do we get more beds and more beds and more beds?
Yeah.
But in the pandemic, there's been a sharp focus on the quality of care in those homes, and a obvious belief that it is inadequate and needs to be better. And I'm hearing from you that you don't see a lot of money in this budget that is dedicated to that particular cause.
Well, no, I think I would say a little differently. I don't see a lot of money dedicated to new beds. I do see money dedicated to trying to improve quality, potentially, but I don't understand enough. I have to get into the details more. So I'm looking at the 993 and think, is this about taking the 4-bed wards and putting them into 2 bedrooms? Is this about adding more air conditioning? So basically improving quality. There's certainly money in there to hire more personal support workers. And they have there's an itemized list. Here's how many we want, and here's how many millions it costs us for every additional number of PSWs.
Okay.
So I think there is more money being put in to address these pain points. I think that's what's interesting about this budget. As I was going through it, it's like, okay, pain point. Yes, they're addressing it. Is it enough money? I don't know. I don't know. Is it enough? Is it too much? What are they getting for it? Some instances they talk about that. Some instances they don't. But they've certainly covered some of these pain points.
Great. Well, I look forward to your report on that.
Good.
A very painful memory for me is the fact that the Premier was able to campaign very successfully in 2018 on his ability to find efficiencies in government spending, and to make the government more efficient, and therefore find more money for tax cuts or lower deficits or something. And I say this genuinely, without any knowledge of what the answer might be. How successful have they been at finding efficiencies in spending and rooting out inefficient spending?
Well, and I can't really answer the question because it's not been something we've been able to sort of get our hands around. But there certainly have been a lot of, what they call digitization initiatives. And I think we've seen, there's, the whole fax machine stuff is obviously theater. That's not a significant cost. When you're looking at $180 billion budget, to throw out a few $1,000 worth of fax machines isn't going to do a lot. But I think they try to drive the point home. And again, it's a communications sort of exercise. There's been a lot of work going on in trying to consolidate purchasing and trying to, putting our insurance slips on digital as opposed to paper. So there's a lot of stuff that's been happening to try to bring Ontario delivery into the modern age, if you will. How much that's saved, I don't know. I mean, we'll get at that at some point in time. But because there's so much complexity in the system, because there's so many different initiatives, and because, frankly, no MPP has actually asked us specifically to quantify it, it's a bit of a fishing expedition if we're to try to go ourselves and try to find it. Now, the AG may be in a position to start to have a look at some of these programs on a value for money basis. But I'll come back to your point, because I've had discussions. When I was at Treasury Board in Ottawa, the whole efficiency thing we heard over and over and over again. And I was actually at that point with a group of folks sitting in front of a pot of money to try to fund programs that would drive efficiencies. And we had, a dozen applications, 2 of which we ended up funding. So they're really, to be able to quantify efficiencies, there's not a lot of them out there. And they are out there, but they take a lot of work to get to. And I think to the DeVries and Clark point, your most effective way to cut spending is to stop doing stuff. That's what corporations do. They decide to close divisions. They're out of this business. They're out of that market. Boom. You cut the business. You cut all of the administrative support to the business. You take that chunk out. It's gone, and you heal around it. And governments, that's how you do it. Politically, though, it's much more difficult because there are always constituencies for these various programs that you're trying to think about eliminating, and you have to weigh that against, the political, the economic and political cost of either eliminating or not eliminating it. So it's, I like to tell people there's this, there are two types of capital in the world, especially in government. There's financial capital and there's political capital, and they aren't the same thing. When you're doing a financial analysis, a discounted cash flow analysis, there is something called sunk cost. You make your investment, it doesn't work, you write it off. Too bad, so sad, I tried, it didn't work. You can't do that in government that easily, right? Oh, we spent $1 billion in childcare, or $2 billion. What was the number that was floated around in one of your discussions with Jenni a couple of weeks ago? I can't remember, but
$2 billion. $2 billion.
It didn't work. So sad. Write it off. But that follows you, right? Oh, you guys wasted this or you wasted that. That's political capital. Different calculation.
So my last question, because we're bloody out of time. I can't believe it already. My last question is, if all the forecasts are wrong and something very different happens, either interest rates go up much more than people had expected, or economic growth is much lower than people had expected, and the fiscal situation becomes much worse, where can they cut?
Well, in a province like Ontario, where you deliver these core programs that are in some respects part of the Canadian identity, healthcare, Medicare is that. Public education to a certain degree is that. And that's half your budget right there, right? And then you've got administration and justice. You can't run a civilized society without having a properly functioning justice system. You have social benefits and child and social welfare, and you can't run a civil society when you have a chunk of folks on the street begging because they have no food, because that's when political upheaval starts. So I would venture to say there's not a ton of space to cut in the Ontario government. You might decide to reduce the number of services you're offering. You might decide to trim away at the edges of certain things. I mean, maybe you do something like more remote learning and larger class sizes, and you're going to maybe have to take a bit of a hit on the quality, but you're going to try to mitigate it somewhere. You may have to look at the types of procedures you're doing medically. There might be a whole bunch of things you have to start to look at really seriously and decide, okay, can we still afford to do this? And if we stop doing it, what's the cost? And that's something that probably should happen on a regular basis, but unless there's a political imperative or a crisis to force it, it's easy not to have to deal with that sort of thing. I mean, it's easy to let inertia run its course because all of these require tough choices that some folks are not going to like, and maybe a lot of folks won't like. I think you lived it, right? You lived it with Paul Martin. Now, the difference there is we had an economic crisis in Canada and we couldn't sell bonds, and everybody else around the world could. So we were looking at a pretty desperate situation. I think the Canadian public had been teed up to that even when Mulroney was there and he tried to get rid of the deficit. So it wasn't something that was brand new to the Canadian psyche. It was there. And the crisis point was, or the inflection point was, holy shit, we can't sell bonds. We can't fund any social programs. We have to do something. And I think they did a pretty good job of trying to sell that concept across the country before actually executing. And if your scenario plays out, we're going to have to do the same thing here, right? We're going to have to go around the province and say, you know what, we got a big problem. We can't fund these anymore. And we got to do something about it.
With all due respect to Paul and all of us who worked on that, it's easier to do federally than provincially.
Yes.
We weren't closing schools.
That's right.
Or hospitals. We were reducing transfers. That's different, right? So somebody at the other end had to do the crappy work and so provincially to find savings. And the point I'm trying to make is it's not a partisan one. I mean, to govern Ontario now is to have to hope for the best because there's no latitude for the worst.
You're absolutely right. I didn't want to put it quite in those words because I'm, a little skittish sometimes being on your show and all, but you're absolutely right. There's very little room to cut. These are all core programs. And as I said, from a political capital point of view, they're woven into the Canadian psyche. You go to the States and talk about Medicare and they'll talk to you about gun control. And those are the two things you don't talk about when you go visit your friends in the States, right? Because it's just so intertwined in the fabric of the society. So you don't cut, and so coming back to a discussion I had with somebody fairly senior in the ministry, as I said, you've got to try to leverage what you can out of the feds because they've got the cash. They are able to issue the bonds. They don't have as you said, the politically difficult choices to make of cutting, closing schools, closing hospitals, whatever the case is. So work that angle as best you can. And, ultimately, Ontario has to succeed for Canada to succeed. It's not as if it's two separate entities. Everybody's in bed together on this one. They have to all make it work. We're all the same taxpayer anyway. So there is an incentive, I think, and I think we've seen it for more collaboration, more cooperation. You're always going to get the bickering, but that's just, politics. That's normal. But I mean, there's been a lot of money moved to folks who needed it in a very short period of time over this last year. That's never happened before. And I think it's been I think it'll prove to be a game changer. It'll prove to be able to show people, holy geez, when government puts its mind to something, it can actually do something reasonably well and important and address a critical issue. Hopefully government can get its act together and improve its ability to execute and deliver and show that in the areas that it needs to play in, it can do it really well. And then, we'll go from there.
Peter, keep keeping everybody honest. Keep keeping everybody honest, right? Because it's we're entering into a very political season, so we'll need reality checks. Reality checks. Thank you for coming on. The cheeseburgers are definitely on me next time we are allowed to meet in Toronto, and you pick the spot as long as it's licensed.
I have a spot in mind. Don't worry about the license.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah. Good to see you.
One of these days, and it can't come soon enough, Canadian vacationers will be back out driving American highways. And from time to time, they'll see a Canadian National locomotive pulling boxcars with that big, familiar CN logo, barreling along hundreds of miles from the border. 30 years ago, that was a rare sight. In the late 80s, CN was still a government-owned railway that ran mostly east-west across Canada, usually carrying grain or wood or minerals. It did actually have a single line that ran from Ontario through Michigan to Chicago, but that route actually lost money. Then free trade opened the gates. Since then, Canadian National has roughly tripled its share of American business. Things really changed when CN bought Illinois Central Railroad in 1998. A few years later, it added a regional railroad in Minnesota and a fleet of Great Lakes cargo vessels, and then the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railway around Chicago. Today, CN steel wheels roll through 16 states. About 35% of its business is cross-border. The company has a major hub in Memphis and reaches all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. NAFTA, and now the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, have allowed CN to pull off complex, borderless operations, connecting factories to seaports, to parts suppliers, and ultimately to retail customers. It's a much bigger, much more complicated market out there nowadays, and CN isn't just keeping up, it's pushing ahead. That's how it rolls. Hey! It's Tuesday. If it's Tuesday morning...
How would anyone know?
How would anyone know? Because the calendar,
Tuesday, Monday,
calendar tells us it's got to be
Tuesday,
the panel.
Wednesday.
There's Scott doing his. Is that a Jewish accent or an Eastern European accent?
No, it's the Godfather. Remember, she goes, "I know American." And Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday.
That doesn't sound like an Italian accent.
Then they blow her up.
It is not an Italian accent. It is not. Hi, Jenny. How are you?
Good. How are you? You're thinking of Michael Corleone's first wife.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he just goes back to America after 5 years of absence in a bowler hat and menacing, shows up at a children's school and says, "Kay, we should get married. Sorry about the last little while where I've been off the picture." Cool? Cool. All right, let's go. I love those movies, but that never made any sense. Kay's just like, "Oh, all right, I think you deserve a second chance. Let's get married, in 3 hours. Fine, sure." Anyway, I'm just going to leave the school now. The kids are on their own. Fuck it. Like, that's apparently how that works. She just gets in the car and goes with them, right?
Speaking of school, you're at home. You're at home again this week?
Me? Yes. What do you mean? Oh, the kids are at home.
Your kids
the kids are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so fourth time since school year began. Got the old 11 o'clock letter. So the way it works with the TDSB is you get a letter telling you that there's a reported case of COVID. And then you go, oh no, in the school. Then you get a second letter telling you that it is in your cohort and your life has just been turned in to a bag of mashed potatoes. So that's, so you sit there and you wait and it's like, oh, do I get the second letter? So we got the second letter. Got the second letter at 11 o'clock on Sunday night. So now the policy is that the children in the cohort and siblings of that child must isolate for 2 weeks. So both kids are home. The peculiar wrinkle in the policy, thank you, Stephen Lecce, is that there is no online school service for the sibling child that is now obligated to stay home, which I guess it makes sense that they should be obligated to stay home. But there's no online service for them because, of course, their school class, their cohort is not out. It's just the siblings that are affected. So they've still got a teacher in a classroom with those kids, except for the siblings that were affected going to school. So there's no online school learning. So Sam is basically just upstairs right now playing with matches and, sharpening knives. I have no idea, right? By the time my Zoom calls are over today, it'll be about 12:30. I got a little run here. And so that'll be, 4 hours of unattended self-direction on his part, which, he can get some shit done in that period of time. That's a good window for him.
How come your kids still have to quarantine for 14 days, but NHL hockey players only have to quarantine for 7 days?
Well, I think it's because my children are not very strong on the puck, first of all. Ben, to his credit, Ben can go upstairs and he skates pretty well, but he gets the puck taken away from him regularly, and so we're working on that. And I'm assuming that by the time he gets those skills improved, he'll be able to do the 7-day quarantine. Now, you know what? I'm actually cool with the 7 days quarantine because those people go from, they go from a hotel onto a bus or whatever to a practice facility, back to it. They're getting tested all the time. I mean, I know that the general rule of thumb is we say, well, if somebody gets to have something, then, that if somebody gets something that the rest of us can't, then fuck all those people and we're going to torch them. But I mean, I think they're living a pretty narrow, limited life already. So I'm not as wound about that, but.
But the decision on the 7-day quarantine was made by the feds, not by any of the provinces, right?
Right.
That's right. Yeah. Federal Health Agency. But, and I understand the kids.
Jenny, is it based on science that we only need to quarantine for 7 days now?
I don't think any decision being made is based on science.
Yeah.
So I think I've read about this before, and I think you could make an argument based on public health information. And as you know, I've an esteemed background as a researcher and also as an academic medical scholar. I think there's a school of thought that says, look, probably 7 to 10 days was always kind of the real incubation period, but people are, started it at 14 days and then. I think they just wanted to be cautious because what we don't know is probably worse than what we do know. Again, they're getting tested all the time. They're living a narrow life. I think we're getting into a world now where some people are vaccinated, some people aren't. I think we're going to have a level of differentiation and just suck that up and put up with it for a bit. That's going to be our life for 3-4 months. And then hopefully we're at a critical mass of vaccinations and everybody gets a passport and that's that.
Well, I think if they go that way, and we're seeing that, even BC, which has been the most non-lockdown province since COVID hit, went into a certain lockdown yesterday. No indoor dining anymore. They shut down Whistler. I think they shut down exercise classes. I think that Canadians are increasingly getting sick of the inconsistency, and I think that as politicians, as Canada, as the country, as we are the only country that seems to be not opening up or have any form of opening up plan for dealing with COVID, I think that you're going to see people start to, especially if vaccines are going at the pace that they're going, you're going to see people react like they did in Germany when Angela Merkel announced that there was going to be a third lockdown, and people went nuts, and then she completely backed down on it.
Well, we can say that, but if hospitals are putting people in parking lots and the ICUs are flooded, and suddenly 20-year-olds are getting sick and really sick, and if, as they say, there's a 56% increase in the level of mortality as opposed to just being ill, no one wants this. People can be frustrated by it. We can be very distressed about what it's doing to our retail sector, but I don't think we can just go, fuck, man, I've had enough. Well, I've had enough, but I don't want to die.
But it's everywhere else is changing. What has Canada done so poorly that we seem to be a jurisdiction? Everywhere else is opening up, and
that's not true. There are places in Europe that have had to roll back too. I mean, it's the variant. I mean, at the end of the day, you got to
But the problem
the
is
variant's ripping through Toronto. We have to pay attention to that, don't we?
Scott Cruella DeVille, the chief medical officer of health in Toronto yesterday, tweeted out and talked about in her press conference that the variant is causing an increase in ICU visits by younger people. And so a reporter then questioned her on it, who had the data, and she had to then go backtrack and say, well, I just heard that. I have actually no proof.
The task force came out yesterday, right? And they said their table came out and said, here's what the study is, right? And so, I mean, I guess, what am I supposed to do? I can't go hospital to hospital and double check the data. All I'm relying upon are the public reports that there's been a study and that in the broader Toronto area, they are anxious about the impacts on hospitalization, on utilization. They are worried about whether or not people are going to have to start making unbelievably brutal triage decisions in terms of, who gets treatment and who doesn't. And they're getting flooded. So, I mean, look at the positivity rate, right? It's 66 or something now, for Pete's sake. So I don't know what, I'm not a cheerleader for lockdown, right? I'm in a house right now with my children all the time. So I'm not enthusiastic about this. But I also am anxious about the variant. It seems to be strong and getting stronger. And I don't know until we're all, until it's dealt with, I don't know how we just go, well, I hate that and I wish it were different. Just because I wish it were different doesn't make it so.
Then, Jenny, there was this bizarre deal yesterday with the AstraZeneca vaccine where we've got advice on this vaccine that varies from province to province, from premier to premier, from the National Council on Immunization to Health Canada. And how is anybody supposed to have confidence about this thing? Let me just make this personal. I'm 58 years old, so I'm 3 years above the cutoff point for where they say it's no longer determinatively safe. So I'm just a little bit above that. 2 years ago, I had a very serious deep vein thrombosis. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I want the vaccine desperately, but I'm genuinely at sea about whether I should get this one or not because of the clotting issue and because there's no seeming real answer to this question.
Well, and this is the problem that I think we all have in terms of the advice. There's no leadership here, and this is where I somewhat I'm blaming the federal government because they're the ones procuring this. They're the ones procuring this vaccine, and they should actually have a standard approach. There should have been some form of standardization in terms of who can get which vaccine. I was reading something yesterday, David, that the reason they've gone 55 and under is because they're trying to capture. It seems to be women in their childbearing years that it's disproportionately affecting in terms of the blood clots. But then you've seen the UK that has had almost no problems in terms of side effects to the vaccine. And so this is it's the wild. It continues to be the wild the Wild West. Trudeau abdicates his responsibility to the premiers, and we have a cookie cutter approach. Like in Ontario, we don't just have a provincial cookie cutter approach. The 34 health districts all have their own rules on top of that. So, if someone can go into, a 70-year-old can go into a pharmacy in like 10 different health districts, but like in Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, where my dad lives, they're not counted, and I don't understand why they would be any different than like Peterborough or Durham region. And so this rollout is going to be tricky for provincial governments, but it's surprising to me that there still hasn't been more pushback on the feds. There were some good articles out. Tonda McCharles had a really good article out, a very fair and factual argument out. But you had 3 vaccine clinics in York Region that had to shut down because the province is out of vaccines now. Like so except
it has 500,000 in freezers, so it isn't out. It's choosing to be out.
And the U.S. stopped their free shipment to the AstraZeneca vaccines. And so, anyways, it's as clear as mud. I don't think we're anywhere closer. And I think that if all levels of government don't get their act together, I think that voters, whenever their elections are going to be, will eventually punish them.
Scott, you're the comms expert. You're the comms expert. Once you've had a day like yesterday where a federal advisory body, the Immunization Council, says, we're not sure it's safe if you're under 55 years old. We think we should take a break and have a look at it. And the Premier of Ontario compares taking the AstraZeneca vaccine to rolling the dice. How do you ever get people to have confidence in that vaccine again?
I don't really know that you do.
Won't everybody want to wait for Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson?
Actually, I don't think everybody will. But I don't think you'll see, because some people will say, I'm willing to sustain the risks. They're just so desperate for some of the reasons we were talking about a couple minutes ago with Jenni. Other people are just flat out, no. In the absence of clarity that it is dangerous, I'm going to assume that after all these trials, it's going to be okay, and they're being overly cautious. But among those who have question marks, like people like you, I don't think there's anything that the government's going to be able to say now at the federal or provincial level that's going to be reassuring. I think there are 2 fundamental communication errors, and this is that awkward space where if you're a government official, provincially or federally, you have to walk this line, particularly if you're a staffer, right? You have to walk this line between how much you appear to be, or you run the risk of looking like you're interfering with the work of that independent body, independent expert body, versus helping that independent expert body really communicate in a way that's helpful in terms of the public. So as an example, I don't think that panel should have been permitted to communicate in the way that it did yesterday. Because if you're not going to tell me why, if you're not going to give me a deeper dive on the reasons for your hesitation, then I, as a member of the public, have no basis upon which to evaluate that. And so you don't create the conditions for people to then be reassured later, because you haven't said there are 3 moving parts here that concern us, so we need to be satisfied on these 3 things. And then 2 weeks hence, they say there have been further studies, those 3 boxes have been checked, and now I have a sense of reassurance. They didn't say that, they just said, we have hesitations about this thing. And it's kind of like, well, so that to me is extremely poor issues communication, and it's going to have a lingering effect. And then you get a hopscotch patchwork quilt set of responses from various jurisdictions, including Premier Ford, who goes, well, I wouldn't take it. And people are all over him, I think quite rightly, for saying that. But, that's inevitable, that if that confusion is created, you're going to get random off-the-cuff responses in reaction to it. So I'm pretty critical of the communication around all that. And I think it started with the panel, and I think somebody had to have taken a heavier hand in terms of looking at the messaging they were going out with and saying, guys, we're going to create a fucking shitstorm here. So I'm not telling you to change what you say. I'm telling you to add to it. I'm telling you to contextualize it. I'm telling you to put it in a context that will permit people to understand and evaluate this. Otherwise, you're yelling fire in a movie theater.
And then after the Immunization Council said their thing, then Health Canada came out and said, we don't agree. We think it's fine. We authorized it. We're still authorizing it.
Right. And this is Jenni's point, right? Which then you get, and we've seen it internationally too, right? Because people have sort of said, well, we've looked at their data, their trials, and you get 10 scientists who give you 11 points of view on the efficacy of that. And so what are people left to do? And you get different personalities in terms of weighing this stuff, all from a legitimate, decent place where one expert will look at it and say, I happen to be a little bit more cautious in my assessment, so I'm going to say that we need more data. And others will say, the balance of risk is pretty low, and, I would say if you look at the actual adverse effects, they're not that manifest, but I'm not a medical expert. And so you go, well, do you go on that basis? Or do you say, no, the way we evaluate these things is the efficacy of the trial data, and the trial data looks like it has some question marks. So let's just pause before we distribute further.
Well, to now go into kind of big P politics, I think the issue that all governments are going to have, and I know that the feds are fighting with the province, are fighting with the municipalities, like it's all just one day it's the Fed's fault, one day it's the provinces, and I think that that's going to be ongoing and has been for the last couple months. But in the United States, you see, they're really ramping up. Biden has basically told all states that by, I think it's May 1st, that the vaccine has to be offered to everyone eligible for the vaccine. They have to be in a position where they can get it. There are other states. There are other states like California and New York that are moving that up. I think next week New York announced that they're opening it up to everyone. California, I think, is opening it up mid-April. So I think as more and more Americans get vaccinated, like we're going to get to a point soon where there's going to be one of the smaller states or what have you that are actually 100% vaccinated of adults that wanted it. So I think this is going to be a pure P political challenge as it looks like Canada is going into another round of various lockdowns. The United States is completely going the opposite way and going on with a normal form of existence.
I hear that,
right,
but you
Jenni.
know what I think?
Yep.
And I thought, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think consistently Canadians have told us something since this thing started, and what they've told us is that to the tune of roughly 70% of people, they say better safe than sorry, and that's just been the sort of I know that people make this point, and we see evidence of it on social media. People going, Jesus, look at New York, look at this, look at that jurisdiction. They're going to be done by May 1st. They're going to be done by May 30th, 31st, whatever, and all that happens, but I'm not sure that's really I think there's a big political jeopardy in, politicians saying, look at the U.S. and why aren't we there? I don't know that that's a measuring stick that people are going to use unless we're talking about being 2 years behind. But if we're talking about 2 months, I think that people are generally in a world of, tell me I'm okay. And that's what people have consistently said, that when economic concerns are brought into collision with health concerns, health wins. When all the frustrations about lockdowns and come into conflict with opening up versus public health wins. That's where the public has been, and I think there needs to be.
Yeah, but you can't carry that. You can't carry that line of argumentation to the vaccination rollout. Yes, people have consistently said in Canada, lockdown, harm minimization over economic opening and opportunity. That's what the large majority of Canadians have consistently told us. They've never told us that they don't care when they get vaccinated relative to other countries. And we did see the federal government's approval ratings dropping significantly early on when it appeared that the United States was dramatically outpacing us. And then that seemed to alleviate when vaccines started to arrive in the country and people started to get vaccinated and people said that's okay. But we are still well behind the United States, and that is still a benchmark that people use. And this is a perfect segue into what we were going to talk about a little bit today, which is the possibility of a federal election. When we think of Canada and space missions, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of you, I'm betting it's the Canadarm. Remember the photos? The red maple leaf against that vast sea of blackness? Well, there's a hell of a lot more to the story. It starts in 1969 with a wholly owned Canadian company called MacDonald, Detweiler and Associates, now known as MDA. Theirs is a 51-year history as an international space mission partner and a robotics, satellite systems, and geointelligence pioneer. Like any leader, it's a story of firsts. Canada is the first country with a domestic communications satellite in orbit because of MDA's contributions. They beat NASA engineers in the race to process the first image from CSAT, the world's first radar remote sensing satellite. The Hubble Space Telescope, the Canadarm deployed it. MDA launched the world's first commercially focused radar satellite. They built a meteorological station on Mars, invented Dexter, a dual-armed robot for the International Space Station, and MDA has just been tapped for the third-generation Canadarm for a lunar orbiting space station. I just cherry-picked a few out of over 50 firsts. Now, they're leading the charge toward viable moon colonies, enhanced Earth observation, and communication in a hyper-connected world. MDA isn't just Canada's largest space technology developer and manufacturer. They grow our economy and they advocate for an entire industry. A space company with a big Canadian flag on their backpack. You can find out more about them at www.mda.space. So that leads right into, Jenni, why don't you take us off with, if you were the federal Liberals, if you were in the PMO, and you were thinking about the prospect of going this spring or summer, what would you be considering? What are the things
I would be considering? So the consideration that I think that I would have if I'm there is, you're looking at a lot of factors in terms of, I'll start kind of maybe not with the most relevant factors. Are we ready logistically to go? Do we have the manpower, the horses, the lists? Are we ready to run a campaign? And I think that I think it's safe to say the Liberals do have that. They have really, I think one of the things that Trudeau has done very successfully that probably not a lot of people will realize outside the Liberals or politicos like me and other parties is he's really modernized the Liberal Party in terms of campaign tactics, in terms of digital, the stuff that has changed so dramatically from even when, David, we were running campaigns. And so
Telford and Pitfield.
Yeah,
Telford and Pitfield, largely.
They've done a very good job on that. I'd also be looking at polling numbers, and so consistently we're seeing varied poll numbers. I know Nanos, I think, has the Conservatives at the lowest, which is sitting at about 28-29%. That's low. But the issue that Aaron has, and this is where it's a plus for the Liberals, is he's never been anywhere close to what Scheer got in the last election, which was 34%. And leading into the 2019 campaign, there were several polls that actually leading into the RIT drop where they had the Conservatives were higher. And so I have, we have talked about this before. I think that I think everyone's anticipating now there's going to be a big economic boom, but I don't think anyone's 100% certain that it's going to happen. I saw it today, and I haven't read the details. Biden is doing a huge tax increase. He's raising taxes in the U.S. Because I think they have to, and everyone thinks that we're going to get spin-off effects from the U.S. and their infrastructure and their recovery plans. But more and more states are actually passing legislation, Buy American legislation. So it's not like there's going to be an economic spin-off for us in terms of procuring supplies and what have you. So if I'm sitting there around the table, I'm thinking, do I go now? Or do I, when things are going very well for us politically, or do I take the chance and go and go later? And I think it's very risky to take the chance and go later.
Scott, this is your chance to get an election call right.
That'll never happen. I think you guys are right. I think that they're going to call an election probably sooner rather than later, just because I assume that I'm wrong. But I let me put it this way. Let me start with this. I actually don't know this question for you, David, but I think I know for you, Jen. You guys go to Vegas? You've been to Vegas?
Mm-hmm.
I've been to Vegas. I don't go to Vegas.
Okay. So I'll tell you a story about Vegas that I think is relevant to this story. Sit back. I'm going to be about 25 minutes. The first time, Fast Chuck and I, we used to go to Vegas all the time. We haven't been there for a couple years, obviously, with all this stuff. But we used to go to Vegas all the time. We used to go every year for the first weekend of March Madness and have a blast, right? Because you can just sit in that Caesar Sportsbook and just for literally 14 hours in a row and not move and just order pizza to your chair and drink one beer after another and lose money constantly. And the first time Fast Chuck and I went to Vegas, we walk in to the casino and I'm looking around like this, and all of a sudden I notice Fast Chuck isn't standing beside me. And I'm like, what? And then a minute later he appears and I'm like, what happened? He goes, I just won $8,000. I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, I just went over the roulette table and I put everything that I brought on red and I won and I got $8,000. And I almost collapsed. Like I kind of like my legs, I lost my sense, like my breathing became shallow. And the point is, I can't do that. The point is, I go to Vegas like your Aunt Doris, right? Like I have different parcels I carry with me that have different denominations of money that I've identified in advance. That this is how much I'll bet on Tuesday, and if I can grow that, then I'll bet more. If I can't, then I'll just go sit by the pool. And I have no risk tolerance. Like I am a scaredy cat. Okay, Fast Chuck walks into the place on the first 10 minutes that he's there and gambles every dollar that he's brought for the entire trip and wins. And if I had done the same, I would have lost the money just because, fortune favors the bold.
I assume the crescendo getting is to a point.
And my point is this. My point is that there is an alchemy here. There is an X factor, and it is risk tolerance. And it's like calling an election is like committing a murder, right? You got a motive, means, opportunity. We all know what the motive is. I want to get a majority. Do you have the means? That's everything you're talking about, Jenny. Does the Liberal Party currently, does the government party, does it have the tools available to it to win this election? And they do. They've built a great, strong, heavy-duty machine. And it's a superior machine right now to their opponents, and that's a great thing. And then what's the opportunity? And to me, that's the big question. That's where Fast Chuck and the roulette table come in. I look at the exact same set of facts that you guys do, and my scaredy cat, low-risk tolerance takes me to, I am terrified that yesterday's AstraZeneca story will be tomorrow's Moderna shipment is paused or something else. I'll be 4 weeks into a 6-week election. Nothing matters more than vaccine rollout. It's not done. And an external event can halt the delivery of vaccines, fuck me up, and make me fail the number one test of competency that people are looking for. And by the time, on the very same day that I'm asking them to approve me, I could be failing the test that matters most. So I am much more in the camp of saying, get to the summer, get those things, get that critical mass of vaccinations, start to reopen the economy, start looking at the $2+ trillion is going to be spent in the US. It's going to lift a lot of boats. Start looking at what our own stimulus is and say to yourself, we're going to have like 8-9% GDP on a quarterly basis annualized in the fall, and try to cash in then. And so I would go in September, not now, but your opponent is weak. Your opponent shows up at a convention and says, I'm for climate change, and the party says, no, we're not. This is a very tempting dynamic to hit that roulette table and blow every dollar you have in the hope that you'll walk back with an $8,000 majority in your pocket. And I think that's probably where we're headed, but it's not where I would go if I were giving advice. I would say be cautious.
So David, I
Jenny.
assume that you never included Scott in the high-level discussions as to whether to drop the writ no 4 or what have you.
I'd always have my knees sucked up to me and say, not now. I don't think now. Not now.
I'm regretting that we did. But
the biggest
Jenny,
mistake we ever made was not calling an early election. So I know
wait a
that.
second. You've had enough. Here's why
It's very
Scott's.
long-winded today.
Here's why. Yes, he is. Here's why. It means he's tired. It means he's tired. He's sharper when he's well rested. The reason
like
Scott's
indoors.
metaphor is inapt is because in Vegas, if you don't bet your money, you can walk out of the casino with all your money. But in politics, that's not the case. So the Liberals have somewhere between a 10 and 15 point lead in Ontario right now, and they have over the Conservatives, and they have somewhere between a 5 and a 10 point lead over the Bloc in Quebec. There is no guarantee that those numbers are there for you when it is convenient for you, right? They're there now, right? And there are a lot of elections that have been lost because people didn't call them at the right time.
I think. Listen, I agree. I think they have to take the risk, and I actually don't think it's even that big of a risk based on the numbers that you just said. I think their biggest challenge is what exactly they say is the reason that they go, because they're going to have to do it themselves. Like I think they could put massive tax cuts in the budget, say that they're going back on their AR-15 ban and a bunch of other things, and Jagmeet Singh will twist himself in knots to make sure that he supports the budget, because he's not going to go. So their biggest challenge leading into kind of May, when I think they would be probably apt to call it, is what exactly is going to be their narrative. And if I'm them, I'm thinking I'm probably going to turn the budget into a values proposition. You've got this is the direction we see the country, especially coming out of COVID. This is going to be our economic recovery versus the other guys, and I think that's probably in their mindset, or it should be, in terms of whether they call the budget, or call the whether they call the election. But it is risky. Like in 2008, like we fell in 11. We had the fixed election date in 15, and in 2008. The government, Harper made the determination to drop the writ himself. I had gone on, and it was a determination that happened kind of mid-August. I was the deputy campaign manager at the time, director of issues management, and I spent 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks in August in Italy. And basically, the first day I was back, there was a very small group of us, like 4 people, and it was basically like we've decided we're going to have an election. And at the time, if you remember, we actually had by-elections going. Like the writ dropped on September 7th, and we had by-elections that were scheduled for September 8th. So there was a lot of factors going in. And so that's just the risk you have to take. Like I remember going down to my office and packing my shit up and basically going, okay. And people are like, where are you going? Oh, I got to just go do a thing. And I basically then just set up shop in the war room for the next 2 weeks. And I know we've talked about this before. There will be 3 days of people grumbling. The media will grumble. The opposition parties will grumble that there's been an early election call and there's a pandemic, and then life will go on. Like every government that brings themselves down is going to face those 3 day stories, but they actually mean nothing in the grand scheme of things. Like 33 days later, it's not in the minds of voters.
I agree with that. My hesitation isn't about the dynamic of calling it. My hesitation is about the X factor of rollout of vaccines, and there's something going wonky. But your point, the most compelling here, I would just add one. The thing that matters most in your analysis as to why to go, David, is the thing I know least about, and that is Quebec. To me, the entire judgment has to be based upon where you're at in Quebec. It's very tempting when you see those juicy numbers in Ontario, but I think you really want to get a situation where you feel like you've got a handle on Quebec, and that's your majority, and it strengthens your national play. And it's the,
Legault has decided they're popular enough that Legault has decided he likes them.
Well, they're standing next to each other all of a sudden, right? So
the federal Liberals are now popular enough that Legault wants to be their friend.
Right.
So
that to me, that is a big factor. That's a very big factor.
But a lot of premiers are. Doug and Trudeau have been hugging each other in terms of policy and rollouts of things since the pandemic started.
I see more occasions of conflict, direct and indirect, though, these days, right? There's more. There's a lot more. Little pissy shots from behind the bushes at one another, it seems, recently. Just as they're both struggling with their own stuff, right?
You guys, I have another reason why I think they should do it off the budget and not wait for the fall. I think Trudeau is a much better campaigner when he has a sense of purpose than when he doesn't. And I think, in 2015, he had a storyline and he had a narrative that he believed in, and he sold it incredibly effectively. In 2019, he didn't have any motivation for the election, and he kind of stumbled through it pretty uncompellingly and unconvincingly. So if they've got a budget that he's proud of, that's a good platform for him.
Yeah, but in that case, the budget is just a surrogate for your recovery plan, and it's just what Jenni said. I presume is how they would do it, and you can do that as well with a little refresher in the fall as you can in the spring. I think, and handicap some of the risk. But I agree with you strongly on that. I mean, you want to go out there and say, look, we need a Marshall Plan for recovery. I've got one. If they have one, I haven't seen it, but theirs is going to be poor, and just let her rip. And
the budget
the
is
numbers.
We talked about the platform last week. The budget is their platform. The budget will be their platform, and frankly,
they're hard to resuscitate, Jenni.
What
like
do you mean?
6 months later, it's hard to resuscitate your budget and run on your budget 6 months later.
Exactly.
No, but the environment's so changing. You could do a quick economic statement in September and pull the plug on yourself, refresh on that budget, and there would be plenty that you would be able to update given how dynamic the environment is right now, I think.
Well, I think, listen, we'll see telltale signs as to what's going to happen. And I'll be honest, in some ways, organizing or getting your campaign ready in minority situations is easier than a majority situation, because you always have to be kind of campaign ready. There were so many times leading into 2008 and leading into 2011 before I went back full time to the party in 2009, where I was like, okay, Jenni, you're on a leave of absence, and I'd go over, and it would be 2 weeks of getting ready for the election, and then it didn't happen, and back I would go. And so it's almost it's almost easier because you just never know what's going to happen. So you always have to stay nimble. And so we'll see telltale signs of rumors that, there'll be a trickle of government staff that start to head over to party HQ, and, planes are being rented, which might be a different dynamic with COVID. I actually think I would never run another campaign where I'd rent a full plane for the election, because none of the media travel like what they did in 2004, 2006, or even 2008. So I think we'll start to hear telltale signs. You always hear rumors from, people ad buy friends or people in different media outlets going, ooh, there was a big ad buy. We don't know who it was, but it's, it's for May 15th to, June 28th. I wonder what that means.
Those rumor people always know how much and for how and what the dates are, but mysteriously the buyer is unidentified.
Exactly. So, Jenni, right now on Twitter and all over the place, you see all kinds of people saying, "Oh my God, this MP has set up their office. This MP is putting signs out there." For our listeners, at this point in time, how many people know what Trudeau's thinking about an election? Ballpark.
Well, my guess is if there's anyone in caucus that he's talking to, my guess it would be someone like a Freeland, just simply because of her position, her, the power that she has within that government. Maybe a friend, like a personal friend in cabinet, like a Dominic LeBlanc. I doubt anyone else in caucus has a clue whether they're in cabinet or not. And my guess is in the Prime Minister's office, probably a handful, like 4 or 5 people max. Like when we were going into 2008, there were, we would have our morning department heads, and there were directors within the office where, we would kind of, they would get up and leave, and, there's 4 or 5 of us still sitting there. Like I'm assuming they put 2 and 2 together, but very few people actually know for certain exactly where their head is at.
For sure.
What Bill Fox calls the meeting after the meeting.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you think the opposition parties are doing right now? Are they wrapping buses or the equivalent?
Well, I assume they're working on platforms, because that's probably one of the items that takes the longest, because with you can't have your scripting documents that we talked about last time, like the scripters being able to do the products for every event and announcement without actually having an approved platform from the leader approved platform. So I assume that that's probably what the opposition parties are doing, and I know that you see notices that candidates are being nominated, all over the place. So I think that you're going to see more activity there. But I think they're doing that just because it's a minority situation. As I said, even if there weren't rumors, and even if there wasn't the conversation that we had today, I don't think that probably the opposition parties would be doing anything different. This might have sped up certain aspects of it, but I think this is what, in a minority situation, they should be doing.
Well, I'm going to wrap up this part of the conversation by saying that Pierre Elliott Trudeau turned his minority into a majority on July the 8th, 1974. So, early July.
Whoa, you think there's going to be a little
Look
little
for
daddy
early
reach
July.
across the generation thing? You're going to get a little father-son playing with the historians' minds? Yeah.
Why not? Why not? I want to just briefly touch on something that Peter Weltman, the independent financial officer of Ontario, said to me in the interview today. And I'm going to paraphrase them. And Peter, who's a great guy, may get mad at me for paraphrasing, because I'm trying to sum up a large part of the conversation. We were talking about the Ontario budget. And he basically said that other than raising revenue, and he didn't recommend that. I'm not saying he recommended it, but he laid that out as a potential choice. Other than raising revenue, there's really no decisions to make anymore in Ontario. Like, the thing is just stretched to the max. They are projecting flatter spending on healthcare over the next decade than will be possible. They're projecting flatter spending on education than will be possible. They're still running deficits as far as the eye can see. This is not a partisan comment. I really am trying to say this, that I'm talking about whoever was in office. The fiscal situation of Ontario is such that you can't make major cuts because all of your money is going into things like health and education and children and social services. You can't make major cuts, and there's no other spending area. Like, he was incredibly de minimis about what could be achieved through efficiency and savings. And so basically it's becoming a province that's hard to govern.
Well, I'm not. Listen, I think there's going to be lots of provinces facing economic challenges. We're a country that's going to have over a trillion net debt on a federal level. That's just not Ontario. So I'm not sure Ontario is hard to govern. The numbers that Doug currently has now would say the exact opposite. I don't. To Scott's point, and Scott, you've made it for as long since we've talked about this, is you're not going to see any austerity budgets from any governments. And so I'm not sure why Ontario is in a different position. I think, listen, I personally think it's going to end up being catastrophic eventually when things start to even out, when the actual health element of COVID is not a focus. But I'm not sure Ontario is any different. I don't see them being in much of a different position than any other government across the country, including the feds.
I wonder if this inexorable reality for Ontario and for many of the other provinces, maybe all of the other provinces eventually, means that 5 years from now, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, the major public policy debate is going to be whether we'll go back to fiscal federalism and whether there is a need for the federal government, with its better credit rating, with its broader scale in order to manage debt, and its different expenditure responsibilities, whether there needs to be a massive recalibration. And as a consequence, you'll see people starting to advocate over time even if interest rates stay low and we can continue to borrow in the way we do. If you're going to see a public policy debate and a political debate that surrounds a massive upload of provincial debt, and that you'll see the Fed say, all right, here's going to be the grand bargain of Canadian federalism. We've done this and that over the years, introduced shared cost programs in the 1960s or whatever have you, but now we're going to have to take a huge and big different step, and that big different step is we're going to consolidate your provincial debts onto our balance sheet where they can be more sustainably managed. In exchange, we're going to ask this, and these are going to be the political trade-offs. And they'll, of course, be different from each part of the country and many of the provinces. But I wonder if that idea is something that is an inevitable outcome of the pandemic. Maybe it was going there on a slow grind anyway, but the pandemic has forced such ballooned deficits and expenditure lines that we're going to have that debate within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and eventually that's what will happen. And there's going to be a lot of sticky policy and a lot of sticky politics along with that process.
Do you think, regardless of who's governing the province of Quebec, they're ever going to agree to that? That the feds take over their budget? Not a fucking chance.
Not take over their budget, take over their debt. But the question is, what will you ask in response? I'm going to wipe out your debts. I'm going to essentially assume your provincial debt because it's easier for me to manage. It's easier for us to do it. And you're right. There's always such a commitment to asymmetry when it comes to Quebec that's going to be a unique debate, but it's going to be pretty fucking unique when it comes to Alberta too. But look, if it's a choice between that and telling your own electorate that you have to shut down hospitals and can no longer fund primary education, and if it's bankruptcy, you're going to find that that people will make decisions that right now seem politically impossible, but they'll be necessary.
I think something's going to have to break at the provincial level because, I mean, the things that we demand, health and education, are just eating those budgets up. And they've got large carrying costs now. And, you know, I mean, if I got the impression from Weltman that if something happened to Ontario's projections, like if interest rates went up, for example, more than they're expecting, they have no capacity to adapt to that. None. Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we finish off with some hey yous? Who's got one? Who's got a hey you to fire out?
Go ahead, Scott. You get to go first.
All right. My hey you goes out without question. It goes out to Minister Stephen Lecce in the province of Ontario, your old workmate and pal, Jenni. And my hey you is, hey you, fuck off with the online learning, okay? I know that you've been talking about it, thinking about, well, you know, we'll sort of tuck this in. We'll create permanent online learning, all right? I don't want it done. I don't want it done just because I've seen what the quality of online learning is compared to classroom learning for primary school children, and it's not good. I don't want it done because I think it's ill-motivated. I think it's being done in the middle of a crisis. I think it's being done at least as much because you want to compound problems for the teachers' unions and other public sector unions, which I think is a big beef for this government. And that's what's motivating at least 50% of this as compared to what's the best education policy. If you're going to do something like that, and there are arguments in favor of it, and there are arguments in favor of let's provide people with that option. If you're going to do that, let's do it when we've all taken a collective break and breath after this pandemic is over, where everybody can be consulted, where people get to throw their weight into that. And that represents a massive reorganization of our public education system in the province of Ontario. It ought to be something you campaign on and ask for permission before you do, just because you want to jam it to the unions. So my hey you goes to Lecce. Don't do what you're about to do, because I know, I got eyes on you, dude. I know you're going to do it, and I know why you're going to do it.
Okay,
Jenni.
my hey yous to Justin Trudeau. If there is not a spring election, I think that they need to do a cabinet shuffle of some sort, and I think that
good stuff.
But the person I think that sticks out like a sore thumb is Patty Hadju. I think that she has been completely ineffective as a health minister. She has tripped the government up in their messaging more than once. She doesn't seem to have a grasp on her file. She's been seen being a hypocrite on several occasions, sitting in an airport not wearing a mask, telling people to stay at home, yet using a private planes to go back to her riding to see her family. And so I think that and miscommunication. Last 2 weeks ago, full confidence in AstraZeneca. She is the face of the Liberal government. I know that you have PHAC and you have other agencies, but she is the face of this pandemic for the Liberal government. And if there is not an election, have a cabinet shuffle in the summer and bring someone who can be more effective into that position.
Well, there you go.
Do you say PHAC?
Yes.
Because I know people, David, you and I have been on conference calls with people who are learned and sophisticated professionals who don't call it PHAC, they call it FAC.
Yeah, that's what they like to be called. But when I was working in Ottawa, especially during H1N1, I felt that PHAC was actually how it was pronounced. But they like to call it, the bureaucrats would go, it's FAC. And I'd say, okay, PHAC.
Doesn't FAC sound like something that comes out of you once you've managed to dislodge that ball in your throat? It's like, FAC, I got a FAC. Oh, that's better. Now I can smell again. Okay, yeah. Like, I don't think FAC is what I want to be called.
All right. Well, my hey you coincidentally goes out to Minister Haidu. For the remaining time that you are in your job, please do a better job of coordinating federal government communications about the pandemic and about the vaccines. The thing that happened yesterday is unacceptable in this circumstance, and Canadians need one stream of advice from their government and a consistent stream of advice. So get your act together on the comms. This could go badly, this vaccine rollout yet, and a lot of it depends on your competence and the confidence you inspire in other people. That's my hey you. Everybody, thanks for being here again this Tuesday. We'll see you next week. I want to thank the Air Quotes Media team behind this. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and MDA, for today's podcast. I want to thank everybody who listened to the podcast, and a special thank you to anybody that goes to the Apple website and gives us a review and a rating. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.